Did God elect certain individuals for heaven and others for hell? Is it possible that God picked you to ultimately just throw you in hell? Is God automatically going to save the people of Israel? The answer to all these questions is a firm no. They reflect a terrible misunderstanding of Romans 9. This chapter isn't a horror story about God predetermining your fate. It is the continuation of a rescue mission that began in Genesis. I'm Michael, the Bible ReThinker. It's time to rethink. When we reach Romans 9, we have only barely passed the climax of Romans 8 when we discover that God's plan is to restore all of creation. In Romans 9, Paul is backtracking a little bit in working through some ideas from Romans 1 through 8, but from a fresh angle. Here is what I mean. There is a sub-narrative in the epistle of Romans. Paul is working through the story of the Old Testament. Romans 1 opens with the echoes of Genesis 1. God created the heavens and the earth with a purpose. He intended to dwell with mankind on earth, and he made humans in his own image. The great problem that Paul begins to unpack in the first chapter is that God cannot dwell with man on earth because of sin and idolatry. Humanity has abdicated its divine vocation as God's image bearer. Sin has brought destruction to our world, but the Creator longs to restore it. Romans 4 works through the calling of Abraham, God's plan to set humanity back on track. God called Abraham because through his descendants, God desired to create a people through whom God would restore creation. They were to be his image bearers. While Abraham is celebrated for his faith, generally his descendants failed to live up to God's plan. Romans 6 speaks of our being set free from sin, but Paul frames it as a new exodus. God has broken the power of a new Pharaoh, that is, the power of sin, and set us free. In Romans 8, we learn that the Spirit has come to indwell us, to lead us to the promised land. Old creation is moaning as in the pains of childbirth. New creation is about to be born. This new creation is a new promised land where God dwells with humanity. After spending all this time framing the story of the mostly Gentile Roman church as a new version of Israel, it naturally begs the question, what about the historical or ethnic Israel? How do they fit in the story of what God is doing in the world? Paul has just finished describing the Spirit-led new creation. But as soon as he mentions Israel, his tone breaks. The joy of Romans 8 turns into the grief of Romans 9. He is distraught because so many Jews have rejected Jesus, the Messiah. He reflects, theirs is the adoption to sonship. Theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all, forever praised. None of these have anything to do with heaven or hell. Neither are they ultimately about receiving the favor of God. God had called Israel to be a light to the nations. This isn't about what God wanted to do for Israel. This is about what God wanted to do through Israel, Through the descendants of Abraham, God wanted to bring blessings to all nations. The reason Paul's heart is broken over Israel is precisely because they had rejected God's call. They had rejected the one God had appointed as their king, Jesus. Usually, when we have come to this passage, we have assumed that Paul must be talking about who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. Those were the major questions at the time of the Reformation in response to the doctrine of purgatory and other teachings from the Middle Ages. But those simply aren't the primary questions that were being asked by Christians in the first century. Hell isn't even mentioned in the entire book of Romans, and the letter never describes heaven as the final destination of believers. In Romans 8, we learn the final destination for believers is in the new creation on earth. Romans 9 is not about eternal destiny. It is about God using a particular group of people to achieve his purposes on earth. The purpose of election is so God's name might be proclaimed in all the earth, as we see in verse 17. Now, I know what I just said sounds incredibly counterintuitive. Throughout Romans 9, it appears Paul is talking about God electing certain individuals for reward while singling out others for punishment. For example, in verse 7, we read that God didn't elect all of Abraham's offspring. He doesn't mention Ishmael explicitly, but that certainly is who he is implying. But rather, he picked Isaac. In verses 11 through 13, he picks Jacob rather than Esau. In verse 17, he seems to pick out Pharaoh only for the purpose of his condemnation. But here is the huge mistake we make when we read these verses. We assume Paul is talking about individuals. We make that mistake because as 21st century individualists, we tend to assume the Bible is always speaking about us individually. But that is usually not the case in the scripture. And that certainly isn't the case here. Everybody named here is a representative of a people, not just an individual. There are nations that are descended from Ishmael. Esau's descendants composed Edom. Pharaoh represents Egypt. But the point is that God had called Israel to fulfill his purposes. It wasn't that God hated these other peoples. It was that God's intention was to use Israel to be a light to these nations. God was electing Israel to be a light to Egypt, to be a light to Edom, and so on. Paul isn't talking about heaven and hell. We made that point earlier. Paul is interested in creation being renewed, like he said in Romans 8. At issue is the people, the group he is going to use to inaugurate his new world in the present. Perhaps our inclination to read Romans 9 as an individualist is most pertinent in verse 21. Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for special purposes and some for common use? To make sense of Paul, it is critical to understand where this metaphor comes from. The prophet Jeremiah visited a potter in Jeremiah 18, and he witnessed the potter working hard to make a perfect pot on the wheel. The potter would try to get the pot just right, but then he would see an imperfection. He would have to ball up the clay into a fresh lump and try again. The potter had to repeatedly go through this process until he finally reached the intended result. In the text, Jeremiah is told that the clay represents not a particular individual. It explicitly states that it represents all of Israel. God was in the long process of working Israel in his hands. He would continue to work at it until he had it just right. When Paul speaks about God as a potter, he is talking about how he is forming all of us collectively into the image of his son. Israel was the clay that never quite became the shape God had intended. So Paul asks the question he assumes his reader is now asking: did God fail? The answer to that question is no, because not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. In other words, it is not the entire nation of Israelites that would be faithful, but only a remnant. And there are people who are part of Israel who are not descended from Israel. Let me explain what I mean. All through the Old Testament, we become acquainted with the reality that only a remnant of Israel is ever faithful. One place where this reality comes to a sharp point is when Elijah grieved before God that he was the only remaining faithful prophet. But God reassured Elijah that God had reserved a remnant of 7,000 in Israel. Paul believed that while most of Israel in his day was faithless, there was still a remnant who had faith in the Messiah. It was this remnant of Israel that comprised the real Israel. Paul quoted Isaiah 10:22 when he said, "Though the number of the Israelites be like the sand of the sea, only the remnant will be saved." Paul also believed that Israel consisted of many who were not descendants of Israel. Paul quoted from Hosea, where God promised there would be a day when Israel would be restored. "I will call them my people, who are not my people, and I will call her my loved one, who is not my loved one." In the book of Hosea, it would be natural to assume the prophet was speaking of God simply receiving his people after they had endured a period of exile. But Paul didn't read the text that way. Paul said God called not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. The newly reconstituted Israel, under the reign of Jesus, consisted of both Jew and Gentile. Remember, Paul is toying with the word Israel. He said, not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. He is modifying the definition of Israel. A person is part of Israel, according to Paul, not because of outward signs like circumcision and kosher food laws, but on the basis of faith, just like Abraham. Israel is no longer defined by ethnicity. It is delineated by faith. Israel has not been replaced. It has been refined. God's intention was always for Israel to be a light to the world. The goal was always for Gentiles to become integrated into the people of God. It is only through Jesus that these plans begin to find fruition. Israel was adopted to sonship, but God described you that way. Israel was the divine glory, but you are glorified. The covenant was with Israel, but now you have become the covenant people. Israel was called, but now you are called. The people God uses to renew creation, the people of Romans 8, are the redefined Israel of Romans 9.